The entire point of going to school is to learn things. In theory, that is. But sometimes those things that are being taught aren't quite true. And that's a huge problem in history classes across the country. Well, we're going to set the record straight with this look at false things your history class taught you. The period of European exploration into the Americas was an ugly, bloody time. There was savagery on both sides, especially when it came to the subject of scalping. However, many believe Native Americans never practiced the awful art of taking scalps until their European enemies landed on their shores and showed them how it was done. The reality is more complicated, and scalping has been practiced for a long, long time. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of scalping being done in Europe from the Stone Age into at least the 11th century. And on the flip side of the ocean, in North America, archaeologists have found scalped skulls dating back to 1325 AD, long before Columbus, Europeans, and the relentless march through Native American lands. It's not clear just when scalping started, but historians have even discovered evidence that it occurred before the Vikings sailed across the Atlantic. And as historian James Axtell writes, by the time Europeans first showed up, they found certain tribes like the Delaware, Mohawks, and Algonquins already had scalping down to an art form. Once the Europeans moved in, everybody stepped up their scalping game. When white settlers arrived in the New World, they put out bounties for the hair and flesh of their Native American enemies, encouraging tribes that had never practiced scalping before to take up a bloody new hobby. Scalping became widespread across North America, resulting in a whole lot of bloodshed on both sides of the conflict. The infamous Salem witch trials kicked off in 1692, and they remain one of the darkest chapters in Massachusetts history. Before it was over, around 200 people were accused and tried for the rather difficult-to-prove crime of being witches, and many were executed in spite of a distinct lack of concrete evidence. 20 of the accused were found guilty and killed almost immediately, but none lost their lives by being burned at the stake like most people think. At least, none of the American victims did. In Europe, witch trials were all the rage, and they executed most of their victims with fire. In Salem, though, different methods were used to bring about the end of a perceived reign of witchy terror. 19 of the 20 victims were hanged on Gallows Hill, while the other victim, Giles Corey, was crushed to death with heavy rocks. Without Kennedy, we may have never had civil rights legislation, or so we've been taught. But Kennedy had little to do with the establishment of civil rights laws. When he heard about the planned March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, Kennedy actually tried to stop it. He even sent Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson to Norway during the march because he didn't like LBJ's pro-civil rights policies. Kennedy was forced to act on civil rights after the Freedom Riders and the assassination of Medgar Evers, but he thought the legislation would never get through and worried it would hurt his chances of passing the bills he really cared about. After Kennedy was shot, LBJ put all his efforts as president behind the Civil Rights Act, capitalizing on the fresh memory of the young president slain. LBJ used the people's grief and frustration to get Congress to act, and in the end, JFK got all the credit. The minimal women's history you learn in school usually revolves around the idea that ladies always had to stay at home and do all the housework. They had a brief reprieve when they had to go work in the factories during World War II, but they went back home after the war until feminism came along. But this is far from the full picture. It ignores the many other women who didn't have the privilege of not working, and hides decades of history where men and women worked equally. Before the Industrial Revolution, work was an extension of the household, and tasks were split evenly between women and men. Even by the turn of the century, women held a quarter of industrial jobs and half of agrarian jobs. Factory work at the time was incredibly dangerous, and gendered labor laws reinforced the growing idea that men should earn the money and women should stay at home. Even into the 50s, though, women workers weren't so rare. Look magazine often profiled female workers, and radio programs talked to so-called career girls who felt women should be able to find meaning and purpose outside the home. Sure, the males on the panels tended to think she wasn't serious about having a career because she occasionally thought of falling in love, but we're not here to debunk the idea that 50s guys had issues. Finally, the career girls got erased from mainstream history until they burned their bras and sang Helen Reddy songs. Or so we're told. But that didn't quite happen like it's taught either. When classrooms gloss through the women's liberation movement, one of the topics that almost always gets brought up is the movement's protest of the 1968 Miss America pageant. According to history, we're told that a bunch of protesters at the event took off their bras and immediately set fire to them. Well, according to Carol Hansich, one of the organizers of the protest, that's not exactly what went down. The truth, the women did want to burn their bras. Police wouldn't let them set things on fire while they were in public and standing on a boardwalk. They were forced to throw a bunch of iconic items like bras, girdles, and Playboy magazines into a garbage can. And that was finally set on fire. Hanish told NPR, "The media picked up on the bra part. I often say if they had called us girdle burners, every woman in America would have run to join us." First used in 1792, the guillotine hacked off around 15,000 heads during the French Revolution. It was so efficient, its final kill wasn't until the 1970s. It got its name from Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin. But despite what most think, he didn't actually invent the machine. In fact, he didn't even like the idea of capital punishment. But in the early days of the French Revolution, Guillotin hoped to make the death penalty more humane by proposing a machine that could cleanly chop off someone's head in mere seconds, avoiding the prolonged suffering that came with most executions of the era. He pitched this idea in 1789, but the job of actually inventing the device fell to Dr. Antoine Louis, and the construction came thanks to one Tobias Schmidt. The completed product was labeled the Louisette, or the Louisette, after its actual inventor, and was tested on human bodies before claiming its first victim in 1792. However, because Guillotin was the man who originally proposed the idea, and thanks to a popular song incorrectly asserting he was the creator, people soon started calling the device Le Guillotine. Guillotin himself never approved of the use of his name. Although most schools taught us that slavery was solely found in the southern U.S., Southerners didn't actually get a patent on racism. People of the North also have a bad history of owning others. The colonial North thrived on the slave trade in the 1700s. During the Revolution, George Washington even told Northern and Southern colonists alike that they needed to fight the British so they didn't become as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. By 1804, slavery was abolished in the North, but not all at once. Some states left in provisions to slowly free slaves over time, and as late as 1840, Connecticut still had 17 slaves on the census. In New York City, a fifth of the city's population were enslaved in 1740, and New York had the second highest rate of slave ownership in the country, behind only Charleston, South Carolina. A shocking 42% of the population owned slaves, and slave labor built much of the city. Even during the Civil War, New York City came close to joining the secession after South Carolina. Though the city wanted to side with the South mostly for economic reasons, they still weren't worried about the idea of fighting alongside slaveholders. The Watergate cover-up is possibly the most notorious scandal in U.S. history, and when people recall the incredible events that led to Richard Nixon's resignation, they often picture a mysterious man lurking in the shadows of a parking garage, a secret informant who helped Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein uncover a real-life conspiracy. For years, this undercover agent was known solely as Deep Throat, and this enigmatic figure became a permanent part of the American consciousness. His true identity was finally revealed in 2005 as Mark Felt, the second highest-ranking member of the FBI during the 1970s. But even if Felt had never come forward, Deep Throat would have always been remembered as the mysterious informant that toppled a president, although that's not exactly what happened. While Deep Throat was an important player in the Watergate story, his role in Nixon's downfall has been massively overblown. As it turns out that for the most part, Deep Throat didn't provide Woodward and Bernstein with information they didn't already know. Instead, as Bernstein explained, Deep Throat largely confirmed information we had already gotten from other sources. Both reporters also made it clear that they already had numerous sources pointing them in the right direction. This portrait of Deep Throat as the man who brought down the White House just isn't accurate. Martin Luther King Jr.'s name is synonymous with noble ideas like civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. King wrote the playbook on how to peacefully resist a totalitarian government, as demonstrated by his historic campaigns in Birmingham and Selma. During those marches, King and his followers never fought back. While he eventually became America's most famous pacifist, Dr. King wasn't always so easy to turn the other cheek. King first became a national figure thanks to the Montgomery bus boycott. After Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white passenger, King organized the resistance movement that forced the city of Montgomery to integrate its bus systems. Needless to say, the boycott didn't win King any fans in the racist community, and as a result, someone bombed the Reverend's house in February 1956. But instead of letting things slide, King decided he would be ready the next time someone came for him or his family. After the attack, armed guards kept a vigilant eye on King, and he applied for a concealed carry permit. As you might expect, his application was denied, but that didn't stop King from stockpiling guns. UCLA professor Adam Winkler says one of King's advisors described his place as an arsenal, and once a journalist visiting King's home almost sat on the pastor's loaded pistol. Eventually, King would change his mind on the matter and get rid of his weapons. But for a brief moment, one of the most peaceful men on the planet was packing a whole lot of heat. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.